When I began studying negative emotions many years ago, the most critical point I discovered was that you cannot make any progress toward health, happiness, love, and fulfillment of your potential as long as you insist on keeping your negative emotions intact. Now, the only good thing about negative emotions, if there is any good thing at all, is that negative emotions are not permanent. Even according to Sigmund Freud, there is no permanent place for negative emotions in the subconscious. In other words, they are unwanted visitors. They are negative habits or negative response patterns that can be eliminated. And the starting point of eliminating them is understanding where they came from, understanding what were the causative factors going back to early childhood that have triggered the development of negative emotions and have given us as adults a propensity to be negative in one way or another. That takes us to early childhood conditioning. Remember, we said before that the starting point of inhibitive and compulsive and negative habit patterns was destructive criticism. Destructive criticism is the great destroyer. Destructive criticism destroys people on the inside and leaves them walking around on the outside. More personalities have been undermined and destroyed. More self-esteem has been cast aside as a result of destructive criticism than anything else that we can possibly imagine. So destructive criticism is the great killer. Now, why is it so bad? Well, we know that children as infants, children as they're growing up, have a tremendous need for love and approval from their parents. In fact, many psychiatrists and psychologists have said that the number one reason for mental illness in adulthood is withdrawal of love, or love withheld. We know that any prestigious person, any person who is important to a child, has an inordinate impact on that child, and that children up to the age of 6 years have very little ability to discriminate between valid and invalid criticism. What this means is that anything that a parent or an older sibling or an older relative, anything that a prestigious person or important person says to a child is accepted as true, is accepted as a valid representation of reality. If a mother says you're a bad boy, if a daddy says you're lazy, if someone says that you're not dependable, if someone says you're stupid or you're clumsy or you're ugly, the child has no capacity whatever to discriminate between valid and invalid. The child accepts that as a true representation of reality. It bypasses the conscious mind, goes straight into the subconscious, and is stored. Many of us as adults are still living on the basis of negative information that was programmed into us when we were children. And then as adults, what do we say? We say, well, that's just the way I am, or I've always been that way. Or some people would say, well, it runs in the family. Your father was like that, children are like that, or your mother was like that, and so on.
Take full responsibility for what happens to you. It's one of the highest forms of human maturity, accepting full responsibility. It's the day you know you've passed from childhood to adulthood, the day you accept full responsibility. And another note, learn to reap in the fall without apology. Without apology if you do well, and without complaint if you don't. That's maturity. I used to have that long list of reasons why I wasn't doing well. To explain. You got to explain, right? Otherwise you're going to look bad. I used to have this funny list called Reasons for Not Looking Good. I used to blame the government. I mean, you can believe that or not. It was at the top of my list. I had a lecture second to none. The government. That was on my list. I used to blame taxes. Look what you got left after they take everything. And they expect you to do well. That was on my list there. Prices, that one's easy, right? You walk into the supermarket with $20, come out with a little half bag. I had that on my list. I used to blame the weather. I blamed the traffic. I used to blame my car. I blamed the manufacturers. I used to blame the company. I blamed company policy. I used to blame the training program. I blame my negative relatives. They were always putting me down. I blame my cynical neighbors. They're just selfish, looking out for themselves. Won't loan you money? They were on my list. I used to blame the economy. I blame the community. That's a pretty good list for not doing well, isn't it? I thought it was good.
Where did it come from? None of these things run in the family. For instance, when I was growing up, my parents had gone through the Depression, and the Depression had made an inordinate impact on them. So whenever we talked about buying anything, all the time I was growing up, my parents would become very, very tense, and they said, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. They had this rack mentality, this we can't afford it mentality all their lives. And I grew up, so even though I've never experienced the Depression, and you've never experienced the Depression in most cases, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, we're still saying, I can't afford it. I can't afford it. I can't afford it. We're still going on the basis of those critical remarks, those emotionalized remarks that our parents said. Maybe your parents said, as my father told me over and over again, you never finish anything you start. You never finish anything you start. You never finish anything you start. Or you're lazy. You never finish anything you start. You know, when I was an adult, I had a terrible time finishing things that I started. As I would get close to the end of a task, I would actually begin to seize up and look for every single excuse to procrastinate and delay. Now, the second factor that predisposes us to negative emotions is lack of love. We know that children's personalities develop to the degree to which they receive a high quality and a high quantity of love from their parents. There's a one-to-one relationship between the amount of love, the quality and quantity of love, and healthy personality. That love withdrawn or deprivation of love is the key cause of unhappiness, negativity, and mental illness in adulthood. Now, in order for a child to feel truly loved, the child must have high self-concept parents, and most of us, unfortunately, had parents that were the victims of their parents, the victims of their parents. What one of the writers says, everybody is a victim of a victim. We are all victims of victims. In other words, parents meant to raise us the best way they could, but they were victims of victims themselves. Now, in order for a child to feel fully loved, three conditions have to exist. Number one condition is that parents must love themselves. Parents must love themselves. Remember, you can never give any more love to others than you have for yourself. If you don't love yourself, you can't love your children. If you have a little bit of love for yourself, you have to spread it over your children. If you have a little bit of love for yourself and that's all taken up by your husband or your wife, then sometimes, even though you want to love your children, they don't have the love. Even if your parents wanted to love you, in many cases, they didn't have the love to give. Why? It's because they never got it when they were growing up. The second requirement is that parents must love each other. In order for a child to grow up feeling self-confident, to grow up feeling loved, to grow up feeling safe and secure, he or she must grow up in an environment where the parents love each other. There is nothing that is more frightening to a child than to grow up in a household where the parents are fighting with each other, where the parents don't love each other, where there's difficulty, because the child always has a tendency, first of all, to be a victim, in that the child is shouted at and screamed at, and the child, it's pretty logical. The fact of the matter is, though, and this is the hardest thing for you or I as adults even to think about, but it is possible that our parents didn't love us. Not that they didn't intend to. They meant to love us, and they wanted to love us, and they had us intending to love us and so on, but simply because they had conflicts with each other, and they had unresolved problems with their parents, and they had the war and the depression, and they had their careers, and they had other responsibilities, they just never got around to it. See, that was the difficulty. They meant to, but they never got around to it. The only way that you can really love a child is by spending a high quantity and high quality of time with the child. High quantity, high quality with the child. 10 minutes a day doesn't do it. Children consider themselves valuable to the degree to which the most important people in their lives spend time with them. If the most important people in their lives, their parents, only spend little time with them, the children conclude that the reason for that is because they are defective. There is something essentially wrong with them, and that's why their parents don't spend time with them. The children don't think rationally, they think purely emotionally. They only think if the parent is here, he loves me or she loves me. If the parent doesn't spend time with me, he or she doesn't love me. So if any one of those three conditions or more existed when you were growing up, the parents didn't love themselves, the parents didn't love each other, or maybe the parents didn't love you because they never got around to it, although they meant to, then you will have grown up in conjunction with destructive criticism with what is called guilt. Now, what is guilt? Well, guilt is a feeling of not being worth very much. Where do we get this feeling? Well, when we're continually criticized by the important people in our lives, and simultaneously we are not given the amount of love that we need, we feel that we're not worth very much. We feel that we are worth less.